1 million casualties. Yesterday is when Ukraine said Russia hit that. It's a mixture of dead and severely wounded. However, I've seen reports to suggest that those that are severely wounded, the chances of survival are very remote because of the lack of Russian medical care. It's symbolic more than anything. You know, if it was going to affect Vladimir Putin in the way that the casualties in Afghanistan forced the mothers of the soldiers to come out on the streets and to force the Russians out of Afghanistan, I've compressed that enormously, then I would say it's significant. But in reality, for Vladimir Putin, who doesn't care about the lives of his soldiers, it's symbolic in that it's a horrific number of people. And that's just the casualties on the Russian side. You know, the Ukrainian casualties we don't know, but that's going to be in a similar bracket. Not quite as many, but we're talking of 1.5 million souls that have been destroyed, and their families have been destroyed by this illegal full-scale invasion by Russia into Ukraine 3 years ago. Well, the casualties have been caused by the guttural fighting that's going on. We're into First World War trench-type fighting, but also then you bring in high-tech weaponry and artillery systems. Artillery will decimate a wide area and would kill or injure many people in those areas. But also the Russian tactics. The Russians are using what people refer to frequently as meatgrinder tactics. And that is just getting waves and waves of soldiers attacking into Russian positions, often without support from artillery and other indirect fire weapons. And they're being slaughtered. But as they're being slaughtered, the Ukrainians are running out of ammunition because they're firing so much of it. The Russians are sending another wave through that's then capturing the Ukrainian positions because they have to fall back to get more ammunition and things like that. That's how the Russians are advancing very, very slowly, but at massive costs. They're losing over 1,000 soldiers, in some cases 1,400 plus soldiers a day. The Russian population aren't reacting that much. The casualties aren't coming from Moscow or St. Petersburg or the European side of Russia. The majority of them are coming from those vast areas where literacy rates are very low, communities are very poor, and the amount of money in compensation that casualties families are being paid is enormous. It's life-changing. In many cases, it's more than they would ever earn in a lifetime, and that is buying their silence. So Vladimir Putin is buying their silence in a way that the Russians didn't do with the mothers of the Russian soldiers who died in Afghanistan, and they put pressure on the Russian government, and that's part of the reason why they withdrew from Afghanistan many years ago. The casualty numbers there were significantly lower, but Putin seems to have got the population behind him. Putin doesn't care about the numbers. He really doesn't care. He's got access to huge numbers of people that are in, albeit he's having difficulty in recruiting them and getting them to come in under permanent contracts. So he's having to use subterfuge to do that, and he's heavily recruiting in North Africa and elsewhere. And we saw North Korean troops coming in. So he is having difficulties, but he hasn't gone for full mobilization yet. If he goes for that, that's when the Russian population will sit up and go, well, this clearly isn't going the way that you're suggesting it is. And that's when it could start to generate some opposition. But Putin has been very good in that anyone that opposes or stands against anything that is going on inside Ukraine or against what the Russian military is doing are very quickly dealt with by the security authorities. Putin's not interested in peace. He thinks he's winning. He thinks he can win in the battlefield, and that's the issue. Whilst he's thinking he's winning, he's got no need to negotiate peace. He's only taking part in ceasefire and peace negotiations to try and keep Donald Trump on side, and he seems to be doing that quite successfully. And he can see the pressure that that's putting on the Ukrainians and President Zelensky. He can see also the pressure that that's putting on to the Europeans. And he's using that pressure to then put various other political pressures on different European countries at different times to try and create greater fractures in the EU and in NATO. And with what's coming out of Washington, and matched with what Moscow is saying that they want to do, he's having some success.
Putin would lose another 4 million soldiers if he felt like that would be to his personal political advantage. And part of the reason that Putin is at war It's not because he wants a piece of Ukraine. It's not because he's upset with NATO. He's at war because he's desperately afraid of his own people. And the best way of having his people have their anger deflected is instead of having them angry at him, have them angry at some foreign adversary. And this is his way of staying in power, because if Putin loses power, then he loses his life. And so Putin is so scared for losing his own life, he's ready to sacrifice 1 million, 2 million, 5 million Russians just to make sure that he stays in power and stays alive. The death or disability of 1 million soldiers is a gigantic number. It's almost an unimaginable number. To put this into some perspective, during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the total losses were about 15 to 20,000 soldiers. And so this is literally, 50 or more times greater than that. And it's just something which is so hard to get one's head around, because it is such an incredible tragedy for those people who have been killed, and it's a tragedy for their relatives. And of course, they shouldn't have been in this war in the first place. Putin should have never started this war. Now, what does this mean? It means that, Russia has lost, probably 1% of their male population, maybe more, and probably like 10% of their population in a certain young demographic. Now, Putin can afford to do this for one simple reason. He doesn't have any electorate. There's no election. He's not accountable to anybody. Putin can lose another million people, and he won't lose his job. If we lost 10,000 people in a conflict in the UK, the government would fall. But in Russia, there is no popular election. There's no press. There's no parliament. There's nothing like that to hold him to account. And in a certain way, that's his military superpower. It's not that he has better weapons or more effective military. He just has the capacity to endure horrific pain like nobody else can, which makes him a very dangerous adversary for Ukraine and a very dangerous adversary for us further from Ukraine. If you have 1 million people dying, you've got mothers and sisters and brothers and children and aunts and uncles. And so if 1 million people have either been killed or dismembered, there's probably like 15 million people who have been personally directly affected by the whole thing. And so surely the Russian people are very upset. But because Russia is a totalitarian state, because Putin is a dictator, anybody who raises their voice ends up going to jail. And so people are angry, they're upset, they're sad, they're heartbroken, and they're also terribly scared. And the reason that he's able to hold on to power in this situation is because he's effectively scared everybody into submission.